Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am happy to be with you. Happy 4th of July. Yeah, I'm doing an episode on the 4th of July because I'm in Portugal. It's just July 4th here. Do I even know any Americans where I live? Not close. I do know Americans here. I just don't know any in my actual town right at this very moment. So, no, my husband and I just came to the office today. I'm working on an episode and happy to be with you. If you are celebrating today, if you're listening to this before you celebrate, be safe. If you're listening to this after you've celebrated, I hope it was lovely and safe. My family, every year for my entire life, has done the same thing for the 4th of July. My great aunt, my grandmother's sister, and her husband bought an island, just a little island on Flathead Lake. Whenever I say that, people think it is very cool, don't get me wrong, but it's not like as grand as most people think. But it is very cool, and it is in such a beautiful place. And so every year they would have a family reunion for, their mother had 9 siblings, I think. And so all of those siblings from my great-grandmother was the oldest, and then so all of those siblings down and their children, grandchildren, and now it's great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren at this point. But so I learned how to figure out who all my first cousins were, my second cousins once removed, all of those really good generational things, because every year we would go to the island and have a family reunion. And so every year that is where I am mentally, if not physically. I am on Flathead Lake on the island with my family. And yeah, so can't wait to talk to my mom tomorrow and hear all of the news and find out how many people were there, who's there. I'm always very nosy to find out who was there after the fact. But that's my 4th of July in the past. And I've probably told you that story before. But at any rate, author today, I am speaking with author Philip Fracassi about his book, Boys in the Valley. This is horror, and I told you last week that it was horror, of course, and that I would let you know. It is dark, but while I wasn't so sure right at the beginning what I was going to think about it, by the time it ended, I was very well sucked into the characters and the story. And so yes, it is dark at points, but it's got some good, compelling characters. It's got a story that keeps you reading so that you want to find out what happens. And even toward the end, I kept thinking, is this wrapping up? I can't tell. Are they going to figure it out? I don't want to give away the ending, but I had some questions at the end. And so, yes, horror, but I did okay. So I need to invent a horror wimp rating, right? So that I can tell you just exactly where it falls on my personal wimp rating for horror books. I'll work on that. Anyway, it is called Boys in the Valley. Let me give you the description of that book. St. Vincent's Orphanage for Boys. Turn of the century in a remote valley in Pennsylvania. Here, under the watchful eyes of several priests, 30 boys work, learn, and worship. Peter Barlow, orphaned as a child by a gruesome murder, has made a new life here. As he approaches adulthood, he has friends, a future, a family. Then late one stormy night, a group of men arrive at their door, one of whom is badly wounded, occult symbols carved into his flesh. His death releases an ancient evil that spreads like sickness, infecting St. Vincent's and the children within. Soon boys begin acting differently, forming groups, taking sides. Others turn up dead. Now Peter and those dear to him must choose sides of their own, each of them knowing their lives and perhaps their eternal souls are at risk. Again, that is the description of Boys in the Valley, and it says turn of the century. That is 1905, so turn of the 20th century, not turn of the 21st century, just in case you were wondering. It's weird that we now have to clarify that, because most of my life turn of the century just meant early 1900s, right? Not anymore. Now my 12-year-old niece really likes to remind me that I am elderly, that I was born in the late 1900s. I'm going to throw her in the Atlantic when she's here in August, which she will love because it's August and it's hot and she loves to swim and she loves the water. So it's not really a threat, but I keep telling her that. Anyway, there you go. You never quite know what's going to happen with this book. It does mention evil, an ancient evil, but you never quite know. People are people, right? And we all have those levels of grayness. And so even before the man shows up with the occult symbols carved into him, even before that, people are still people, and people have various levels of good and bad and things that aren't very easy to qualify. So you never quite know where people in the book stand anyway. And then you have this situation that is made even worse by the fact that they can't leave due to a blizzard. And so there's a lot of factors that escalate this situation. And I don't want to give a lot away about this story because you need to read it for yourself, especially if you are a fan of horror. So we're going to go ahead and turn to the interview so Philip can tell you more about the book and the writing of the book. Again, it is called Boys in the Valley. The author is Philip Fracassi. Hi, Philip. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Sarah. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm happy to talk to you. We're going to talk about your book, Boys in the Valley. But before we do that, if you could just take a few minutes and share a little bit about yourself, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a lifelong writer. I've been writing genre fiction, primarily horror fiction, since around 2015. I started publishing probably right around the same time, and I've had a few novels come out, a few short story collections come out, some novellas, and I'm a former screenwriter, so I've got a couple movies that I've written that have been out over the last decade or so, and I write full time now, so it's pretty much all I do. And but before I was able to do that, I was working primarily in the film and TV industry. Now I'm just excited for Boys in the Valley to come out with Nightfire and Orbit. And I did a 2-book deal with them. So we've got something planned for next summer as well. And, and I'm just very grateful to be in this position.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. And, I'm always fascinated when people who have worked on screenplays, either vice versa, you write screenplays and then you write novels, or the other way around. I know it's very different. So how is that for you?
Yeah, it's very, very different. It's kind of two different mediums. Screenwriting is more technical. You're writing a story, but you're really building a foundation for which a lot of other people build upon, directors and producers and designers and actors and all that kind of stuff. So you're just it's more of you're creating a framework that is then modified 1,000 times as the process goes on. Whereas with fiction, you're writing, what you write is what, for the most part, is on the page and what people read. So it's a much more personal, it's much more of a controlled artistic form. So I much prefer fiction writing. I still do write screenplays occasionally. I've adapted a few of my stories to screenplays, and I've adapted a few of my screenplays to stories. They are translatable, they are adaptable, but for the most part, the approach is very different when you compare fiction to screenwriting.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah. Can you then give an overview of Boys in the Valley?
Yeah. So Boys in the Valley is about a boys' orphanage at the turn of the century. So I believe that it's 1905 is when the bulk of the story takes place, and it's in a remote area of Pennsylvania. So it's very secluded. It's far away from any cities or towns, and it's just kind of like this converted church in the middle of this Pennsylvania Valley. And 30 boys live there, along with a handful of priests who are their guardians and the and discipliners, and take care of the boys for the most part. And then one stormy night, a visitor appears at the orphanage door, an injured man, along with the sheriff from a nearby town. And the man is covered in strange occult symbols, and he is ranting, and he is badly injured. And they bring him to the orphanage in the hopes that one of the priests can heal him or keep him alive. And the man dies, and when he dies, whatever evil was residing inside of the man is released into the orphanage. And the children begin to act differently. They begin to take sides. And then what goes on from there is basically the bulk of the book, which is where these children are now battling one another for inside of this small orphanage that becomes encased in a blizzard. So they're all kind of trapped there. And it's a kind of, the rest of the story takes place as some of the boys kind of running with this evil, and the other boys sort of fighting against it, and the conflict that occurs, along with the priests that are there as well. So that's primarily what the book is about.
And generally, books of this type that are set in an orphanage aren't happy books in the first place, but you just took it a step further and went with possible outright evil. Can you talk about the inspiration behind the story?
Yeah, so I try not to have an agenda with the story, meaning I try not to tell the reader what to think. I just present information. And what I mean by that is I'm not judging anything. I'm not, I just read a review recently where the reviewer seemed very confused because they were like, on one hand, Fracassi seems very condemning of the Catholic Church. On the other hand, there are some, Catholic values that emerge that seem positive. And I think the reason that reviewer was confused is because I'm not here to tell people what to think. I'm telling a story, and I'm laying out the facts as they come. So to your point, there is a lot of hardship at the orphanage. The way the boys are treated, it's very strict. But I don't think, the food is hard to come by, and they're very poor. The orphanage is very poor. So there is that sense of, and the way they are disciplined is extreme. So I think there's a sense of, I don't know if I would say evil, but there's definitely a sense of hardship. There's a sense of despair. And while some of the boys try and, like Peter, for example, the main character, while he tries to kind of rise above that despair, some of the boys are drowned by that despair, and some of the boys fight against that despair. And I think when this visitor comes and I use everything with a bit of an asterisk, but this supernatural element is entered into the mix. If you choose to believe there is a supernatural element when you read the book, I think all of those baseline psychological baselines, we'll call them, for each of the different boys, kind of is amplified. So if they were, fighting against these hardships or against this despair, then that becomes amplified, kind of cranked up to 11. Similarly with those who try and rise above it. And I think that's where the conflict really becomes goes to the next level, because now it's not boys arguing or disagreeing. It's now boys full out surviving, and killing and trying to, in an effort to kind of express their hatred or their anger, at what's been done to them. So that's kind of the way I set up the book. I don't think there's a lot of black and white in this book. There's a lot of gray areas as to why things are happening, as to what exactly is happening, as to why the boys are doing what they're doing. And I try and leave that gray because I don't think there's any necessarily one answer.
Now that you know a little bit more about the premise of the book, and a little bit more about the story, we're going to go ahead and take our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about that evil and how it manifests itself. Is it really evil? What is going on? Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Philip Fracassi. We are talking about his novel, Boys in the Valley. Let's get back to that interview. And actually, you said the very thing that I was going to follow that up with is that, I said possible evil because it is,
right.
It is very gray. No, there's no one person that's all good, all bad, all one or the other. It's not any set of binaries.
Right.
Then there's the blizzard, which traps everyone in the orphanage and ramps everything up. So, but part of the story is told from the perspective of Peter, who is 16. He's one of the orphans. Can you talk a little bit about him and what might resonate with him for readers?
Yeah, so Peter's an interesting character because he is sort of this guiding light, if you will, that the reader follows through the story. And he's probably the least complex character in the book, and that's purposeful. I wanted him to sort of be this, he's the one holding the reader's hand as the story unfolds. And I guess I think what readers will empathize as far as Peter is concerned is that he's trying to make the best, he's trying to make the best of this situation. He's trying to understand the situation that is incomprehensible, and he's trying to save, who he can. And I think that's when you're a reader, you're kind of in the same boat as Peter is. You want the boys to survive. You want, goodness to prevail. You want to get through it, to get through the story unscathed. And I think, and you want to understand what's happening. So I think in that sense, Peter is very much holding the hand, like I said, of the reader, which is why I wrote his character a little bit, why I wrote his perspective a little bit differently than the other characters.
Yeah, and like I said, part of it's from Peter's perspective, but then you have different perspectives. Peter's is first person, the others are not.
Right.
Were there any challenges in writing both from multiple points of view and in first and third person, or was that more helpful? How did that work for you?
No, it wasn't a challenge. It was a decision I made very early on. Because I wanted the reader to feel like when Peter was when I was telling Peter's story from Peter's perspective, I wanted the reader to feel like I was talking to the reader, where I was bringing the reader along throughout the narrative. And when I go to third person for the other characters, I think there's 3 other POVs, maybe 4 other POVs. I'd have to double check my math on that, but I know for sure there's David and there's Brother Johnson, and so when I switched to those other POVs, I kind of was like, okay, now we're kind of going back into story world. So it wasn't difficult. It was just something I wanted to try. I had seen it done once before, and I thought it worked really well. So that's why I decided to do it that way. And I think ultimately, there's also I don't want to kind of do a spoiler-free review, obviously. So, but there's other reasons I do it that way that make more sense when you are finished with the book.
Yes. And books like this, there's always that point where you don't want to go past talking about what you know, because you want people to read it and not know how it ends, or even what leads up to that ending.
Right.
The fourth perspective was Father Andrew. So you said
right. Yeah.
So you're
Andrew
right
gets a POV. Yeah.
Yep. How about research? What particular types of research did you do for the story?
So it is a historical novel, as I said. So, but I was kind of, I lucked out in that because the story is so isolated, I didn't have to go crazy with the research as far as the time period was concerned, because I'm not describing a lot outside the 4 walls of the orphanage. There's a couple chapters where I leave the orphanage, but for the most part, I'm talking about what's happening there. So the focus of the research was on orphanages of that period, what the boys wore, how they were run, how orphans were treated, and how they talked, what words were around, what words weren't around. So a lot of the dialogue was very much triple checked as far as that is concerned. And outside of that, there was some research as it pertained to the church and the structure of the church and the priests that were running the orphanage. There was some research as it pertained to demonic possession, a lot of biblical research. But like I said, because it was fairly contained, I didn't have to go too crazy. I've just finished another novel for Nightfire that's coming out next year. That's based in the Civil War, American Civil War period, and that book was far more extensive because the main characters kind of trek across the land, and they're in battle, and there's these towns that they go into, and there's Indian tribes who they interact with, and so that one was far more extensive. It was everything from Civil War weaponry to the type of trees that grew in the South and that kind of stuff. So that was far more extensive than Boys in the Valley. It was actually not too bad. I just wanted to make sure I got the boys right and the relationships with that they had with the priest, and also some of the things that the boys went through prior to being orphans, and what happened to what happened during that time to children who orphanages would, for example, sell orphans to factories where they would be work as child labor, things of that nature. So a lot of that stuff makes its way into the book, as along with detail stuff. How did the bathrooms work? How did plumbing work? How did heat work? That kind of stuff. So those were all things that I researched to make sure that it was authentic, or as authentic as I could make it to be.
Well, it's an interesting time period too, because 1905, you've got, it never ceases to amaze me how much it's changed in just a little over 100 years. So you've got certain kinds of technology that we would recognize today, but in some other ways you would still have horses and wagons and different ways of farming. So I would imagine that was making sure you're getting that perspective right.
Yeah, and in addition, they weren't in a city, so what was
Right.
available in a city was not necessarily available in a remote orphanage. So I kind of had to really make sure I was being meticulous about what they would have and how they would be set up, and yeah, that's all. And those are all things I just kind of have in my back pocket. So as I go through the story, if I need to accent a scene here or just to create a little bit more realism, um, but I try not to overdo it. I try to really like for this book in particular, I really tried to let the characters, be front and center, and all of the period elements really be in the background. Basically, they're the background of the stage. So the characters are really driving this, propelling the story forward. So in that sense, I just wanted to make sure I got their dialogue, the dialect right, and make. And I think some people seem to think that they sound too modern, but from everything that I've read from that period and all the research I've done, it's it's pretty accurate. I think people are surprised, think that people all back in the turn of the century all spoke in these and thous and that sort of thing, which isn't really the case. So
Right.
so yeah, but that was one of the things I definitely honed in on. I want to make sure I got right.
Hmm. And because it was so character focused and character driven, what kinds of character development do you like to do before you write? Or do you prefer your characters to maybe evolve as the story unfolds? Is it a combination thereof for you?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I'm when I write a novel, I do a lot of um, work before I begin writing. So I'm an extensive outliner. I always want to know exactly what happens, chapter by chapter before I begin writing the book. I don't want to write myself into a blind corner. And I don't want to, and I want to, when I'm writing, I want to know where the story's going because I want to be able to allude to things that might happen later, or I want to sort of just construct the chapter knowing what's going to happen in the next chapter. Maybe the next chapter is, you know, action packed. And so maybe this chapter can be more of a setup to that. So I just want to know, for me, I really want to know every beat of the story before I begin writing. And so as it pertains to characters, I have a very, very good idea of the characters' personalities, um, their physical traits, their ethnicity, all that kind of stuff. So I know how they talk, you know, how they think. Um, that's something I do during the outlining process. So I have a lot of notes on the different characters. And I have their roles, right? So I know what they're going to be doing within the story. So I kind of, that helps a little bit. In other words, if this guy's going to do something brave, I can't make him like a complete coward the whole time. I have to show a little bit that he's got a little bit of backbone so that it's not a complete anomaly when later he does something heroic or whatever, or those kind of things. But they do often, as you're writing, they will surprise you a little bit here and there. I've had other books that I've written where the characters have really surprised me. In this book, the only character that I thought kind of evolved, Peter evolved a little bit. Some of his inner conflict became more um, bigger than I'd anticipated it to be. David, who's also kind of like a main character B in a way, is kind of him and Peter driving the story in my mind. David uh, is a very complex character. He's sort of my doubting Thomas um, character in the sense that he doesn't really know why he's doing the right thing, but he is. And so he was really interesting character to write. And Brother Johnson, of course, was an amazing character to write, full of conflict, um, and kind of seesawing throughout the novel. So I really love the characters in this book, and I had so much fun writing them. And I wish I could go back and write them some more, but that's probably not going to happen. But but yeah, but most of it's developed ahead of time, but there's always tweaks that occur while the story goes, because every now and then they do something that surprises you a little bit.
Time for our second break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about those grayer characters in the book, and are there challenges to writing them? Are they fun to write? What is it like to write those types of characters? Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Let's go ahead and get right back into the interview with Philip Fracassi. Do you enjoy writing those sort of gray characters, like Brother Jonathan, who you're never quite sure what he's going to do? But do you like writing those? Maybe not better, but are they more interesting or more challenging to write than just your kind of more straightforward characters?
Yeah, so I have most of my books and stories. One thing that is fairly consistent about my work is that my characters are very human. They're very real in the sense that they are conflicted. There is dark inside each one of them, and there is light inside each one of them. When you read one of my novels, you will most likely find yourself sympathizing with the villains and maybe not agreeing with the heroes all the time. And my heroes don't always do the right thing, and my villains sometimes will do things you don't expect them to do. And so I try and keep my characters very real. And sometimes that will bother readers a little bit. Or bother reviewers or readers a little bit. I think it can be a little confusing because I don't really follow tropes when it comes to characters. I write very unlikable characters who are the heroes of the story, so I don't really think too much about when I'm writing characters. I just want them to be real, and I want them to feel real, even if it annoys you, or even if you don't dislike them, and in a traditional narrative you are supposed to like them or root for them. Sometimes sometimes I don't have you necessarily rooting for the hero. So that's just my personal preference. It's how I like to write characters. It's how I like to create them. I like conflict within my characters. I like them to be not always doing what you expect them to be doing, and I think that makes them very human, because we are very fallible, and we don't always do the right thing, even if we're good people. So that's why I try and instill that into my fictional characters as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's partly what draws you to writing within the horror genre?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it hasn't been announced yet, but I did just sell a science fiction novel, my first science fiction novel, to a Big Five press. And so I do write other genres, but even that science fiction novel it's a thriller, so there's definitely some dark elements. But I think I think you can have with horror or with supernatural thrillers or whatever you want to call it. I think the characters are darker than probably a lot of characters in maybe non-genre fiction. So in that sense, there's more of a spectrum. You can go way dark and have a little bit more fun with those darker elements of each character. A little more extreme, which is always fun. I think what draws me to horror, generally speaking, is I like the idea of not having parameters when I'm telling a story. I like the idea of the sandbox not having, borders. I want the sandbox to be ever expansive. So, like, I think what makes Stephen King novels so much fun to read is that you don't ever really know where that story is going, what he's going to do, because it could go anywhere. You could have, a giant cosmic turtle pop up at the end of your story. You could have, fall down a well and you're in another dimension. You can have monsters coming out of the closets, claws bared. So I like that about horror. I like that I can do anything I want, that there are no restrictions, that I can make the story as big and wild as I want it to be. And so that's what's fun to me about writing horror or writing about the supernatural stuff, is that you don't have to play within reality. You can play outside of reality. And to me, that's a big draw, because I don't like to limit necessarily my imagination. And in that sense, I like to be able to do whatever I want, whatever I come up with, whatever I can dream about or imagine. I want to be able to put it on paper. And so that's what's fun about horror, is you can do all that stuff and no one's gonna be upset with you.
Or they might, but they're just going to be upset because things didn't go the way they wanted them to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And even science fiction has, even science fiction has its parameters. Even fantasy has its parameters.
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, to be a fantasy book, you have to have certain elements. Be a science fiction book, you have to have certain elements. So I think with speculative fiction or horror fiction, that's the one genre where you can really cut loose. And so I love playing in that sandbox.
How about you mentioned that you've been writing since about 2015. What made you decide to start writing fiction, possibly for publication?
Yeah, well, I've been writing since I was a little kid. But I spent most of my 20s and 30s writing non-genre fiction. It's still pretty dark, but for the most part, literary, I guess would be the word you'd use, just not horror, not sci-fi. And I just never really was able to break through. I couldn't get anything published. And then so around 2010, I decided to start writing screenplays. And I did, and I was fairly successful with that. I wrote some screenplays for Disney. I wrote a movie that was on Lifetime television. But I found myself really, because I'd always read horror, so I've always been a huge horror fan. But for whatever reason, when I was writing my fiction, I wasn't writing, for the most part, I wasn't writing horror fiction. I was writing character studies and dramas and stuff like that. And so, but I think there came a point when I was writing screenplays, I started writing more and more horror screenplays. And then I decided around 2015 to give fiction another shot, but this time writing horror fiction, because I had so much fun writing these horror screenplays. And yeah, and so it was really just like a subconscious connection that was made. I don't know if it was just the right time. Maybe I'd explored all the things I wanted to explore, and now I was ready to kind of take all those things that I had been writing about and push them into a supernatural structure. I don't know if I just got to the right age and I just ripened, who knows? But yeah, so, and then once I started writing genre fiction, things really took off. I published the first story that I wrote called Mother, and then I wrote a story called Alter and published that one right away. And then I published a story collection, and things just kind of snowballed from there. And I've had a lot of fun doing it, and I've been able to actually go back and read and publish some of the novels. I wrote a couple novels, in my 30s and early 40s that were not genre, but I was able to go, now that I had a bit of a following, a bit of a growing readership, I was able to go back and republish, publish some of those novels. So they're kind of making their way out now, which is very gratifying as well. And the reception's been really good. So yeah, but moving forward, I definitely will stay within the genres, I should say, of horror for the most part. I do have some science fiction ideas I want to write. I have some combination of the two. I might dip my toes into fantasy at some point, but it'll always be rooted in, horror, in the sense that I always want to, my stuff is always going to be violent and scary. And that's something that I really enjoy doing. So, I'll probably be doing that for a long time.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you. If someone were to ask you about writing, is there a main piece of advice that you might give to someone who's thinking about writing, maybe in the horror genre, or maybe just writing in general?
Yeah. So what I always tell young writers or new writers, new writers are not necessarily young writers. I'm a case in point of that, but, is that, is the key to being a successful writer is perseverance. That's something that was instilled into me early on by my writer friend Laird Barron, who told me that one of our first early conversations, that there are going to be lows, there are going to be highs, but you have to keep going and you have to keep working. I am at a point now where, like I said, I'm able to write full time, and it's keeping me, a self-sustaining thing, but it took me about a decade to get to this point. And there was a lot of rejections. There's a lot of really dark moments. There was a lot of me wanting to hang it up. And I just kept going. And I think that you just have to believe in yourself and believe in your work and believe in your voice. And you also have to know that it's hard work. It's not just sitting at a keyboard and typing a fantastic story. It's a lot of promoting. It's a lot of getting your name out there. It's a lot of marketing yourself, working with editors and publishers and lawyers. And, when you start getting your work, it's a wider readership and you have film and TV people coming at you, then you're dealing with agents, you're dealing with those guys. And so it's really becomes running your own business. And I think it's the right mentality to have for a writer, which is, it's really a business. And I know it doesn't sound very artistic, but it's the truth, because publishers are not going to make your book a success. Agents are not going to make your book a success. You have to make your book a success. And like I saw a tweet a few months back, and somebody had tweeted about, some young writer had tweeted like, wait a minute, you're telling me that I have to write the book, edit the book, help design the book, create the website, and deal with and then, go out and promote and market the book to readers? And the answer was yes, you do. Because that's what being a writer is, and being a professional writer is. And so it's a lot of work. And that's my advice for young writers going in, is to realize that up front. That way you're not caught off guard. You're not wasting time waiting for somebody else to do it for you. Create the work hard on creating as many stories as you can, and then work your butt off to get those stories into readers' hands. And that's the job. But it's very it's very satisfying. It's very fulfilling to see readers with the finished product of a novel. I'm excited right now. I'm seeing a lot of people with copies of Boys in the Valley, even though it doesn't come out for another week. So it is, that's the very gratifying reward for what is ultimately, years of hard work.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, is that some people have the story that they want to tell, and they think if they just write it, then the rest will kind of take care of itself. And unfortunately,
Right.
it's not that simple.
No.
Following that very constructive and helpful advice, we're going to take our final break of this episode. When we come back, we'll find out what Philip likes to read in his free time. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Philip Fracassi. So most authors that I talk to are also avid readers. So when you're taking the time to read just for you, not for research or anything like that, do you tend to read in the horror genre? Do you read in a variety of genres? Who are your go-to authors and genres?
Oh man. So I read a lot of I read a lot of horror because I get sent a lot of books from publishers or from friends or authors. So I would say I spend about half of my free time reading for, like, to blurb something for a writer or for a publisher. So all that stuff is almost always in the horror genre. So that kind of scratches that horror itch, if you will. There are a couple writers in the genre who are go-tos for me, as you mentioned: Paul Tremblay, Josh Malerman, Laird Barron. Those guys have a new book out. I'm reading it. I'm grabbing it and reading it that day. Joe Lansdale's great. Although Joe puts out so many books, it's hard to keep up with him. But when I'm not reading that stuff, I read a lot of I do read a lot of nonfiction. My favorite nonfiction writers are, love Michio Kaku. I read his science books. I read books about, I don't know, like the history, or it's fun for me. Psychology books, poetry books every now and then. And then other than that, I kind of read widely. Yeah, I read classics that I haven't read in a while, or I'll read science fiction, or I'll read fantasy, or I'll read, literary novels that have caught my attention. But for the most part, my horror, like I said, the horror stuff is pretty much the stuff I read so much horror for work, I guess you could say, that when I'm not working or when I'm choosing to read whatever I want, I tend to veer into other genres. Stephen King would be another one who, obviously, I read his books the day they come out if I can. So I'm a huge fan of King's work. But yeah, so I read pretty widely. There's not a lot of rhyme or reason to what I decide to read. I'm usually reading 5 or 6 books at the same time, depending on my mood. I'll pick up, depending on which one I pick up, is kind of, in the morning I tend to read more nonfiction, and in the evenings I tend to read more, genre fiction. So, so I'm kind of all over the place. But I love reading. I always try and find at least a couple hours every day to read, even if I'm on a deadline or, spending 10 or 11, 12 hours at the desk that day, which is pretty standard for me. I always try and find a couple hours to read.
All right. Thank you. Let's talk about the internet and where people can find you, website, and any social media that you might be active on.
Yeah. So my website is my first initial and then my last name. So pfracassi.com. That's the best place to find me because you can email me through my contact page. I list all my books there. I have a little store where you can order signed copies of stuff. All my blog is there with all my most up-to-date touring information or event information or releases of the newsletter you can sign up for. But then I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram, and I'm on TikTok, if you can believe it. Of those three, I'm most active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. TikTok's more of a every now and then kind of deal because I don't really make a lot of videos of myself. But and then in Facebook, there is a cool little group that was started by some readers about a year and a half ago called Fracassi Freaks, which is a group that's all about my books and my writing. And I spend a lot of time there and I do exclusives for those guys. There's about 500 members right now. So that's another fun place to jump in if you want sort of the inside track on what I've got going on.
Which is very cool, but was it slightly disconcerting when someone started a group with that particular name and about your books?
No, I loved it. I was so honored, I mean, I don't know if I would have picked that name, but it was kind of cool. I just got this, invitation popped up one day on my Facebook saying, "Hey, you've been invited to join Fracassi Freaks." And I was like, what is this? And it was really neat. And it's grown over the last year and a half. And I've created last year I did an exclusive chapbook that you could only buy in the group. I do giveaways in the group a lot. And there's 3 guys who run it. The 3 admins are really active and we become buddies. So it's been a lot of fun. And I really appreciate that group because they're so supportive and they get really excited about new stuff that comes out and they get out there and spread the word and help me out on that front. So it's been a real blessing and I have a lot of fun with it. And social media is it's a lot of work, but I think it's I've found a lot of value from it too. I've enjoyed meeting a lot of writers that I probably would have never have met. And I enjoy seeing what other people are doing and letting people know what I'm doing. So I'm not as against social media as a lot of writers are. I think it's a lot of fun. I just don't get involved in any hardcore discussions, and that keeps me clean. You know what I mean? I just focus on the arts.
Stay away from the drama. Always a good plan.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Stay away from the drama.
Well, Philip, we've talked about a few different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to make sure you highlight at this point?
No, I guess I'll, just because we're talking a little bit about new writers, I guess I'll throw out that I had a limited podcast called The Dark Word that you can find on any platform, Spotify, Google, Apple, Amazon. That's it's 24 episodes, and every episode I interview a different writer, and we just talk about the business of writing and being a professional writer. So that's something that writers should check out. I think you'd find it very informative. And I have Boys in the Valley coming out July 11th from Tor Nightfire. It's coming out July 13th from Orbit, UK. My new book is coming out next June called Serafina, also from Nightfire and Orbit. And I have a new story collection coming out this October called No One Is Safe. So all those books are, I'll be promoting through social media and through my website, newsletter, and stuff like that. So I'll plug those real quick. But otherwise, no, I just hope people enjoy the work.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me about writing and Boys in the Valley, especially.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you once again to Philip for joining me on the podcast to talk about this book. When I invent my own personal level horror rating system, I will tell you what it is, but I can tell you that I had no nightmares and I was able to read it without too much issue. So, if you're not too sure about horror, this is an okay place to jump in there. It is. Everyone has their own triggers, so you need to know what those are for you. This one definitely has some religious elements. If that's something that is not a topic that you are comfortable with or enjoy, then this might not be the book for you. But if you're okay with that and you like the elements of good versus evil, or maybe not, you should definitely check out the book. Or if you have someone in your life who enjoys reading horror, then this book and some of the other suspense, thriller, horror that Philip writes, you will definitely want to check out. I hope that you either are having a wonderful day or you had a wonderful day, whatever it was that you ended up doing. If you celebrated, great. If you had to work, I'm sorry. If you didn't celebrate but you didn't want to, you stayed home by yourself. Excellent. I hope that the fireworks were okay if you are sensitive, or if you have pets that are sensitive. I know that's really, really hard. So hopefully everybody is safe, and both physically and mentally and emotionally after celebrating. I hope that you will join me for the next episode. I have a returning guest coming back to the podcast. Coming back. I kind of was repetitive there, wasn't I? But I have a returning guest to the podcast. Anna J. Stewart will be joining me to talk about the first book in one of the first book in her new romance series that is set on the Big Island of Hawaii. So join me for that. I enjoyed speaking with Anna the last time she was here. Looking forward to having her back. Join me for that episode. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, there's a few things you can do to really help the podcast out. The first is helpful for both of us. Like, follow, subscribe, whatever the platform that you are listening to this podcast on allows you to do. That way you'll always know when there are new episodes out. You can also leave a review on those platforms, and written, starred, either way helps the podcast get out to more listeners. It doesn't have to be detailed. It can be something very simple, but it is helpful, and it does help the podcast get out to more listeners. And of course, then there is social media. You can follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Love hearing from you. Come find the podcast on social media. Tell me all of your bookish thoughts. I love to hear them. Stay safe. Have a great day. You know, I always tell you at the end to get lost in a good book. And I was that kid who, even though we were outside and I was in the lake the vast majority of the day when we were on the island, I also had a book in my bag. And so I would swim and I would read and I would swim and I would read and I would eat and I would read and I would swim and I would eat and I would read and I would hang out with family. So whatever you're doing, I still hope you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.